Welcome to Writers of Silicon Valley, the podcast where I interview the best UX writers and content strategists from around the world. Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. My name is Patrick Stafford. I'm your host. I'm especially excited because we've had 8 or 9 days of 0 cases of coronavirus in my home state of Victoria. Right now there are only 4 active cases, so the sun is shining and I'm particularly happy. Not only that, but I know that the last week has been stressful for not only Americans, but everyone around the world watching the outcome of the presidential election there. It did not happen on the day of the election, but instead happened 5 days later. So I know it's been a stressful week for some people, so I hope this episode can lighten the load a little bit and give you something to enjoy to take your mind off what has been a particularly active week in politics. I was going to publish an episode today about Button and talking with some people about what we learned from the conference and so on, but that's been delayed to next episode. So today I'm bringing you an interview with someone who might be one of the most experienced UX writers I've spoken with, not just in this podcast, but in life. I'm speaking to Christie Fremon. She began her career as a technical writer working at companies like Zimbra, Sony, Yahoo, at VMware. Then she moved into UX writing and she began as a technical writer at Apple and then moved into UI writing there, where she worked on Apple Music, the iTunes Store, the App Store. She worked at Google for a time, she worked at Nava, and now she's working as a UX writer for Rivian, which makes electric vehicles. Now you may ask, what does electric vehicles have to do with UX writing? Isn't it just a car? We'll get into that. Today's conversation was illuminating to me because when you've spent so much time in this industry, you pick up just different stories and different techniques to get your work over the line. And sometimes for people who have been in UX writing for only a short amount of time, they don't necessarily have that experience. So they're wading through everything without guidance. I hope this episode can provide people with that guidance. It's a fantastic conversation. So yeah, I really hope you get something out of it. Hope you enjoy the episode and I'll see you at the end. You have an extensive CV. So you have worked as a technical writer since, I guess, the early 2000s at a range of different companies, including Yahoo. You worked as a documentation specialist at Sony, a technical writer at VMware, a technical writer at Cloud.com. You started as a technical writer at Apple and then became a senior UI writer for iTunes. You then worked at Google as a UX writer, Nava as a UX writer, and now you're at Rivian as a UX writer. I'm guessing you work on the UI and the software that's placed in these electric cars. Is that right?
Yeah, that's everything behind the wheel and also in the connected mobile experience, which is really exciting to work on.
Yeah. Now, that is probably one of the most extensive CVs that someone on this podcast has had. It's a real treat to be able to talk to you because I feel like there are a lot of UX writers right now who have been in the game since the 2010s, right? Maybe they worked in content strategy or blogging or something beforehand, and then they moved into UX writing as part of a design team later on. You've worked as a technical writer for, nearly 20 years. So I feel like you have a really good perspective on how this particular industry and this particular role has changed over time. And I'd be really interested to hear you talk about what you think has been the biggest shifts you've seen, both as a technical writer and a UX writer, in the language as design field during the past nearly 20 years.
Yeah, but luckily at Rivian, Tech Hubs is actually integrated into the UX experience. So I'm getting a little bit more perspective on that right now. And I think what I would say is that there's a little bit more focus in tech writing on how to be contextual and how to meet the users in a place where they need that information. And then in the UX writing realm, I feel like the perspective that I've gotten over the last 10 years is that we've shifted a lot. When I first started, it was really focused on UI writing and how to get the right error message, and really looking at just the parts of the interface that a lot of the stakeholders felt frustrated with, or that they didn't have time to dive into. And over the last decade, the entire discipline has blossomed so that we're looking at the user experience over the whole experience. And that includes the glamorous parts and some of the nitty-gritty parts. And I just love the emphasis on being able to look at the writing holistically, being able to integrate it more tightly into the visuals, into the audio, and into all parts of the experience.
Yeah, okay. So looking at something with a holistic perspective rather than just sort of in your own silo. That's interesting. Let's backtrack a little bit. How did you actually get into technical writing? How did you start your career?
I really, when I was younger, wanted to do all sorts of things. I wanted to be a whale watcher, archaeologist, novel writer, scientist. And obviously, you can't do all of those things all at the same time. So I had to pick one.
You can't. I'm sure someone could.
Yeah, I mean, send me the job. I'm interested. Yeah, so I started focusing in when I was in college on writing, because it was one of the disciplines where you really got to research a lot of things and learn about a lot of things. And I really, really enjoyed that aspect of just continuously learning new things. But it was really more focused on fiction. And a friend clued me into the fact that you could do technical writing and start learning about coding and start learning about product design. And that was a huge eye-opener. But I never do things the easy way. And so instead of just focusing on technical writing, what I did was I really dove into my studies with an emphasis on learning about digital design and print design and editorial skills such as indexing or proofreading. And I really wanted a broader perspective than just the instructional writing that a lot of technical programs really focus in on and try to get the fundamentals.
Yeah, because I think one of the interesting things about not only the technical writing field, but also the time in which you joined it, there's something really interesting about it. So after the .com crash, I guess you could call it, in 2000, 2001, all the hype had been sucked out of Silicon Valley, really. You still have a tech scene, but it's smaller than it used to be, and it's still basically getting on its feet. And when you join in the mid-2000s as a technical writer at the beginning, I feel like the hype is still trying to come back because, you've got Apple that had just released the first iPhone, and it was exciting, but people still didn't know if it was going to be a success or not. And there wasn't, I think, the insane injection of VC money that there was maybe 4 or 5 years later. It's an interesting time because I think as a technical writer, as you said before, it was a much more siloed focus. There wasn't that holistic focus you get now as being part of a UX team or as part of a design team. And I'm almost trying to imagine what it's like coming into the industry like that. To me, it feels like kind of a lonely experience where, so you're working on your own and maybe you're doing good work, but it might be hard to stay connected to the overall impact you're having on a company. Am I right there? Or was it an exciting time for you?
It was a bit of both. You talk about how it felt in the early 2000s. It was kind of a scary time. I was just beginning to work some entry-level jobs. Most of my friends were struggling to stay employed or experiencing layoffs. And there was that sense of excitement paired with a little bit of desperation. My first jobs, too, were with startups, Postini and then Zimbra. When we were at those startups, the experience there and the mood there was incredibly excited, but also a little bit nervous. We didn't know if we were going to make it. And I think that I was incredibly lucky. Both of those companies ended up being purchased. Postini got purchased by Google. Zimbra got purchased by Yahoo. But there was a little bit of uncertainty there. And part of working at startups of that size is that you really are one of the few content creators there. In both companies, we had very, very small tech writing teams. And so it was pretty lonely. And I think that one of the things that I was missing and lacking was a sense of community there.
Could you explain for people listening, what is the difference between technical writing and UX writing as you do it now? Because I think there are definitely some similarities in that a lot of what UX writers do now actually used to be done by technical writers several years ago. And there is some crossover. So could you just give a little bit of a breakdown as what you see the difference between a technical writer and a UX writer?
Yeah, not a problem. I think that, when I was practicing technical writing, the majority of the focus was on creating manuals and user guides. And what I find really interesting is that that type of technical writing is so focused on task completion. You're trying to use a product, you're trying to get from point A to point B. And that's a lot of what we try to touch on in UX writing as well. You're trying to get a user to successfully complete a task or successfully get through an experience in a way that feels really satisfying and good. And I think that for me, the main difference is that technical writing, when I was practicing it, tended to happen after the interface was designed. And so it was really afterthought. You'd put together this tool and then think about how to get people to use it successfully. And for me, that was a source of frustration where I really wanted access to the interface while it was being designed. And I wanted to figure out how to make things easier for people to use and then provide the support and then provide the instructional writing or the explanation of the different ways that you could use the tool. And I think that currently, technical writing is beginning to breach that gap a little bit and get more involved during the time when somebody is using an interface rather than being a standalone guide that they use afterwards. And I also think that, at this point, UX writing is stepping in and taking over some of the tasks that technical writers used to do. So, for example, technical writers used to do a lot more writing of dialogues or error messages. And at this point, I think that that's really solidly in the realm of UX writing. Although some tech writers that I chat with still get asked by engineers to do that sort of writing.
Yeah, now I think it's because the trend in software has been to put much more of the help and support within the onboarding experience. So you're no longer having to go to documentation and then read it. The software is trying to guide you through it, which of course necessitates a writer being part of the design team. So kind of UX writers kind of stealing technical writers' lunch a little bit. But to me, I still see them as two distinct roles. To me, they're still very much specialists. I've spoken to some people in the past few years, and I think that sometimes technical writers fear that UX writers might be taking over, as though that they can sort of see their job disappearing, and that they need to upskill into UX writing. What would you say to that? Is the technical writing role disappearing, or do you still see a position for it?
Oh, I think there's definitely a need for technical writing still, and I don't think it's disappearing. But I do think that technical writers need to spend a little bit of time learning about human-centered, user-centered design and thinking about how to apply that to their technical writing work. But for example, in my current role, we absolutely need technical writers taking a look at our product.
So you've worked at a number of different places. I wish I could talk to you about all of them. But before I get there, I want to ask you about your time at Sony. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what you were working on, because if I'm correct, you were working on the PlayStation family.
Yeah, that's right. It was such a wild time working there. I was working in the third-party testing group, and so our focus was really integrating third-party games with our first-party platform and offerings there, and looking at how to document a lot of internal processes and make it easier for third-party game development houses to work with PlayStation. And, it was a really interesting company to be at, because every week we'd have access to just armfuls of different games, and to be able to look at all of these different designs coming through and be able to interact with all of them felt like Christmas every single week.
Are you a gamer? Are you into games, or was it just a job?
No, I love games. I used to be way more into console games and PC games. Nowadays, I'm more into tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. One of the interesting things I am seeing in the games industry is that UX writers are crafting out more of a role for themselves. Now, obviously, you were a technical writer at Sony. I think your actual title that you've said was documentation specialist. But it's interesting to hear from people who have definitely worked in that industry. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is Apple. Apple, to many people, is this mythical place where, the design teams there are championed as some of the best in the world. And you started there as a technical writer, and then you became a UI writer for iTunes, where you worked on Apple Music, the iTunes Store, and the App Store. Now, this is in 2011. So this is, I guess, a few years before UX writing really starts taking off in terms of, the number of people talking about it. Obviously, there are UX writers. I mean, you were one. I'm really interested to hear about your perspective in working there. And then also what it felt like to make that transition from technical writing to UI writing within one of the most successful tech companies in the world.
It was definitely an experience. It's so funny you talk about there not being a lot of UX writers back then. When I started, I remember hearing, and I don't remember where, but I remember hearing that there were less than 300 UI writers in the United States at that point.
Oh, wow.
And so it felt like, it was so few. It felt like there just was nobody out there who was doing what I did. And part of being at Apple meant that there was a lot of motivation to not talk about what you were doing. I remember there were times when I'd leave my office and there would be reporters who would approach me and just try to talk to me to see if they could get a story. They wanted to know what the next big release was. And it was so pervasive. You couldn't even go for coffee. I remember going for tea someplace and having somebody behind the counter insisting that I tell them when the next iPhone came out. You had to be really careful. And if you left the building and you had your Apple badge on, people would approach you and they'd start asking you really invasive questions. And it was also really interesting, this shift to doing UI writing full time from doing technical writing. Obviously, when you're junior in a position and you're really learning your craft, you are going to make some mistakes. Writing at Apple was such a high visibility role that if I did make a mistake, within an hour of it going live, it would get screenshotted. It would appear on speculative blogs, journals. And so you really just had to be very careful about what you wrote and make sure that it got a lot of reviews.
What does it take to be successful at a company like Apple?
Oh, I would say that one of the things that really helped me succeed at Apple was a desire to be involved in conversations and to really engage and celebrate the products there. Because there's such a passion there for creating products that are simple, that are usable, and that are really the pinnacle of design. People are really passionate and they do want to have those conversations and they want to elevate the product. So, the two edges of that are that if you're able to get into those conversations and participate, people are so enthusiastic to hear your ideas and to iterate and to get you involved in the design process. But the flip side of that is that it's always very high stakes. And so sometimes it can be tough to get involved. And especially with, at the time, UI writing being such a small discipline, it was a struggle, a many-year struggle to try to elevate the craft there and to try to make it something that the design teams wanted to engage in and that they wanted to see the value of.
It's interesting you talk about this because we're recording this a few days after the Button conference. And there are a lot of great talks there. Among them, there was a lot of discussion about representation and how do you get yourself in the room. Even through this decade, UX writers are still having problems with getting into a room and representing themselves. I'd be really interested to hear from your perspective some strategies that you've used, both at Apple and anywhere else you've worked, to represent UX writing in these design meetings, in these projects. How do you get yourself in the room?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it continues to be relevant. I still deal with that challenge with every role that I step into as a UX writer. And I have to say that at Apple, our ability to be successful, a lot of it came from my manager at the time, Darcy Groves, who was an incredible advocate for the craft and worked incredibly hard to elevate our discipline at that company. But the tactics that were really successful, and again, it was a multi-year process to get our voices elevated and to get a seat at the table. But a lot of it involved building relationships and building connections. So having chats with the design managers and the designers on the team and understanding what their goals were and what they were frustrated with, and trying to figure out, okay, how can I support that? And for me, it became especially difficult because while I was there, we had a couple of relocations, and there were times where I wasn't even sitting with the design team. And so not being close to them and not being able to attend some of those meetings meant that the best way for me to integrate and to be able to have that seat at the table was to camp out at their desks and say, like, hey, I'm working on this project and I have some ideas and I want to hear what you think. And I want to hear what you think is important to communicate. And that opens up the conversation, and it puts you in a place where you can understand what their perspective is and what their risks are. At Apple, there were a lot of designers who really wanted to be able to have their designs shine in product reviews, and especially in front of C-level stakeholders. And so one of the more successful tactics was trying to work with them to figure out how to get them ahead and how to support them in making their products get great reviews.
And I think this sets you up well when you're successful at a place like Apple. To me, it seems like you can be successful in a design team anywhere. I can only imagine. But the pressure on design teams and product teams at Apple during that time, and this is sort of 2010 to 2015, would be immense. Because you were there when Steve Jobs died. The amount of pressure that I'm guessing product teams have to show everyone, we can succeed without Steve Jobs. We're independent. We don't need to be attached to one person. That, to me, I think would trickle down to the work that you're doing. And I'm sure you felt that pressure.
Yeah. My manager once got feedback directly from Steve Jobs about the writing in the UI. This was before my time there, but he'd printed out the design and handwritten on it with feedback. And you can imagine that feedback got integrated very quickly. From that day forward, our entire team knew that it might be that Steve Jobs was looking at our designs. And, even after his death, we knew that the executive team was very close. And there were times where the work that I was working on was being reviewed by Phil Schiller or Johnny Ives. There was a lot of attention to detail and a lot of attention to the words. And that actually helped with being successful there because of the fact that our leadership cared about that level of detail.
We just talked about how do you represent yourself in a design meeting, or how do you represent and advocate for the discipline of UX writing. And I think saying, well, if Steve Jobs cared about it, you should care about it, is probably the ultimate trump card in that perspective.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure that really carried you well through your work at Google, and then you worked at Nava. But now you're at a company called Rivian, and you're working on electric vehicles. And I suppose a lot of people don't really think about UX writing when it comes to an electric vehicle. There's software in the car, there's an app experience. I'd be really interested to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing now and what you're focused on.
Yeah, I am so excited about the work I'm doing now. This work is dealing with one of the more complex interfaces that I've had the pleasure to work on. It includes an instrument cluster panel, notifications, an infotainment app, a navigational app, and so many more features. And when you think about smart devices, this vehicle is one of the more complex smart devices that I've ever worked on. And I love it. I think that one of the challenges is that there's so much to consider and so many different touch points in the vehicle that you really have to keep an eagle-eye view on everything that's in motion and everything that's being created, and think about the way in which you can achieve consistency and the way in which all of these different moving parts work together. And I think also because of the fact that this particular vehicle is something that people will be driving and they will be on the road with it, there's also a lot of emphasis on how do we create an experience that's not just delightful, but also intensely safe and something that people can rely on.
The safety aspect is something that's really interesting to me from a UX writing perspective, because, one of the metrics that we like to judge ourselves on is this concept of delight. Are we delighting the user? And I think one of the biggest examples of that is something like, the messages in Slack, where you have no messages to read and it says, You have nothing to read, here's a pony, or whatever. That's cute and fun. If you're putting unnecessary words on a screen in a car, that is not just distracting, it can be unsafe. So I can imagine that when you're discussing, the length of strings or even your tone, that must be at the forefront of your mind, which is a lot different than some of the constraints and challenges that other UX writers might face.
Right. I mean, we have some guidance. We've got NHTSA guidelines and homologation to take into account. Homologation being some of the limitations and restrictions on what we can do legally. Basically, what I have to keep in mind when I'm writing is if the message that I'm putting on the screen, if the words that I'm putting on the screen are appearing when the vehicle is in motion, it's so different than any other experience I've written for, because you assume that the screen is the last thing that the user is looking at. They're going to be looking at the road. They're going to be looking at the passenger next to them, or if they've got a kid in the back seat, they're going to be paying attention to that. And so whatever I write has to be incredibly concise and incredibly to the point, and it needs to be incredibly respectful of their time and give them the tools they need to make safe choices.
It's a good reminder, I think, that as UX writers, sometimes we tend to think about use cases in a very simplified format. So, for example, let's take the Slack example. We tend to think of a use case as something like, they're either on a desktop or mobile, or they're on a tablet, or it's a push notification or whatever. But we need to really think through more use cases in terms of circumstance. So as you just described, someone's in a car, they're distracted, they might be distracted by children, maybe they're looking at something, all those sorts of things. I think we could do well to think more broadly about use cases like that in other types of apps, because number one, you're just creating a more well-rounded experience. But number two, people don't use our products the way that we think they're going to use them, right? So it's good to hear you talk about looking at notifications and use cases from a broader perspective.
Yeah, and they've got so many different channels of communication coming in. We have to pay attention to, because we've also got our connected mobile app, making sure that we're not sending them push notifications while they're behind the wheel. And our integration with Alexa means that we have to think about, are we communicating with them visually, but also are we talking to them at the same time? And how are those messages unified? And I think that, to your point, it's knowing the context of when something is being used is so powerful, because, the way that people engage is going to be different if they're looking at something at home, if they're with their family versus alone, if they're looking at it on public transit, or if they're in a bar. I love all of the access that I have had in my profession to user experience research and foundational research that helps support some of those use cases.
How do you use tone of voice for a car?
The style guide that I wrote for Rivian is just called How to Talk Like a Truck. And
I was kind of like being a little bit facetious, but I think maybe I was right on the money with that one.
Right on the nose. Yeah. I think that when you are being the voice of a truck, it's really tough because there's such a range of tone and voice considerations. For example, if you're in an emergency situation, we always talk in our industry and field around being sensitive to bearing bad news. And a lot of the times that bad news is just, you couldn't complete the task that you're trying to do. But if you've crashed your vehicle, if you've just had a really deep scare, there's so much more emotion happening there and so much more adrenaline happening. And so taking a look at the messages around how you keep someone safe and how you help guide them through tough situations is really, really difficult. And, we had to take a really close look at how do we communicate respectfully and be a voice of calmness and really focus on just the very bare basics. How do we support them in that particular time? And then also on the flip side, there are so many joyful things that you get to do in a truck. So, for example, we've got all of these different abilities to do off-roading, and being able to get people who might not have ever done that experience to try something new and to be able to learn while they're doing it presents a lot of opportunities for really excited, adventurous messaging. And getting the tone on that is a little difficult too. You want to celebrate with them and also be helpful and get out of the way when they want to have that experience and focus on what's in front of them.
Exactly. You've worked at so many different companies and you've got such great experience at all of them. You've talked a little bit about what made you successful at Apple, a little bit about what's made you successful in your role now. Looking back over your career, what are the traits you think have served you well? And what are some things you think you've learned over time to help you become a great UX writer?
Asking questions. I think that above anything else is the number one trait that has served me well and that I see serving other UX writers well. Because if you get asked to write something and you just write it and hand it back to someone, you're only writing for the scenario that you've been presented. And so much of the time, if you ask the questions and take the time to get to know a little bit more about the use case and the design considerations, you start finding out that the task that's been put in front of you is so much different than how it was initially presented. And you start learning about opportunities to split messaging or to integrate into the visual design in a different way. I was looking at something just today where if I had just looked at, the words on the page and said, oh, they could be better in this way, I would have missed an opportunity to get a visual illustration in. And there's so many other instances that I can think of where asking questions and being curious gives you the tools that you need to know that you need to reach out to your brand partners or know that maybe you should check in with legal on something. And that information isn't handed to you on a silver plate most of the time. So curiosity is really a good tool. I think that the other thing that serves me well is the constant desire to make things better. And it makes it a little bit tough when you're out with your friends and you're like, oh, you know what would be better? And I say this like even during COVID time, I don't get to be out with my friends. I'm still looking at things and thinking, I would have liked that more if this. That attitude of constantly wanting better and wanting more is what allows you to start thinking about novel ways to improve interactions and experiences.
Yeah, it's a good mindset to have. It's a growth mindset. I could sit here and talk to you all day. Unfortunately, we have to come to a close. The one thing I like to ask everyone at the end of the podcast is what's something you've read recently or listened to or watched that would be useful for all the writers listening to this podcast? On
my desk right now, and I'm just getting through it, is Design for Cognitive Bias by David Dillon.
Yeah, now I've seen him promoting this book and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. So I hear it's really good.
It is so fantastic. I started listening to his podcast when he first launched it. I was really lucky to have seen him speak at a LavaCon event several years ago. And his work on cognitive bias and design has just been really inspirational and really great. And this book really dives into it in the detail that I really wanted to hear more of in his podcast. So I'm eating this book up. It's fantastic.
Awesome. This has been a fantastic conversation, Christie. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insight with everyone. Really appreciate it. And good luck with talking like a truck.
Thanks so much.
That's my interview with Christie. Thank you so much for listening. As I said before the beginning of the interview, next episode is an interview with some folks who attended the Button Conference, and we're going to break down what we learned from there. If you have any feedback on the podcast, please hit me up at patrick@uxwriterscollective.com or my LinkedIn or on Twitter at PD Stafford. Always happy to hear feedback, suggestions for guests, or anything, really. If you do like the podcast, please leave a review on iTunes. It helps others find the podcast. Hope you have a great couple of weeks, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.